The hurricane's eye was meant to be the safest spot on Earth. At least that's what everyone was saying. We were hunkered in the basement of our neighbor's home, a solid brick structure that had seen its fair share of Florida hurricanes. The wind howled outside, a terrible, ravenous creature attempting to claw its way in. Rain pelted the boarded-up windows, and the floor shook with each gust. There were 6 of us, my wife Kendra, our 2 children, Jasper and Willow, and our neighbors, the Millers. Old Miller, a weathered guy with eyes that had seen too many storms, kept talking about the eye, how it was a trap, a siren's song. "Don't trust the calm," he'd say, his voice scarcely heard over the wind's howl. "It's a lie the storm tells." We disregarded it as an old man's ramblings, the result of a life spent fighting the forces of the sea. The weather radio verified that the eye was on its way. A short pause, a moment to breathe before the storm came with ferocity. When the wind slowed down, an eerie quiet fell. It was so sudden and complete that it seemed like the whole planet had stopped breathing. We crept out of the cellar, our feet timid on the creaky stairs. The world outside was illuminated in a strange, almost fluorescent glow. The sky above was a perfect circle of pure blue, surrounded by a massive wall of whirling grey clouds. It was gorgeous, terrible, and completely wrong. "See," Kendra said softly, grasping my hand. "That's all right. He worst is over." But a shudder rushed down my spine, a primordial feeling warning me that something was wrong. Old Man Miller's words rang in my ears. We strolled outdoors, the air thick and heavy, imbued with an unusual silence. The roadway was covered with debris, trees had been uprooted, and electricity wires snaked across the ground like fallen serpents. But it was the stillness that was the most unsettling. There is no birdsong or rustling foliage, just an awful, echoing quiet. Jasper, ever the explorer, was the first to break free. He dashed towards the debris of our swing set, his laughter resonating unnaturally in the silence. "Jasper, get back here," I called, my voice harsh and uneasy. He did not listen. He was now at the edge of the woods, peering at something concealed in the trees. "Jasper," I shouted again, my heart hammering against my chest. He turned, a slow, artificial grin creeping over his lips. It was not a child's smile, but something icy and predatory. "Daddy," he said, his voice warped and strange. "Come and see, it is wonderful." Then the wind returned, not a roar, but a whisper, a gentle caress that sent shivers down my spine. The sky darkened, the circle of blue above decreasing, and the wall of clouds closing in. We sprinted towards Jasper, but it seemed like a nightmare. The wind pressed against us, and the air became thick and heavy, making it difficult to breathe. The trees trembled, their branches twisting and reaching for us like grabbing claws. And then we saw it. A person stood in the clearing, illuminated by an unusual light. Tall and bony, its skin stretched tight over bones, and its eyes shone with a malicious glare. It grabbed Jasper in its grasp, his face pallid and terrified. The apparition turned and locked its stare on me, and at that moment I understood. The eye was a trap, not a haven. A ploy to entice the naive into a nightmare. The wind shrieked, screaming at us and threatening to rend us apart. We clutched to one another, our screams drowned out by the storm. And suddenly, everything went dark. I awoke hours later, the storm had gone, and the sun was a faint ghost behind the departing clouds. Kendra was alongside me, her face drenched with sorrow, Willow held in her arms. Jasper was gone. Authorities searched for days but found no sign of him. They stated he was probably washed away in the storm surge and lost at sea. But I understand the reality. I saw it in that creature's eyes, hunger and victory. The hurricane's eye is not a safe zone, It's a hunting field where horrors roam the land. They occasionally bring something back with them after they go. Story 2. The air was heavy with the odor of salt and anxiety. Hurricane Celia, a Category 5 monster, was smashing into Isle of Palms, South Carolina, and our little beach cottage was directly in her path. We were hunkered in the reinforced storm basement under the house, the noise of the wind physically present, rattling the very foundations of our shelter. There were 4 of us down there, myself, my elder brother Finn, my closest friend Darby, and her father, Mr. Hayes, a bear of a man who seemed to shrink beneath the storm's intensity. Darby was the calmest of us all, grasping my hand in the darkness with a surprisingly firm grip. The storm raged for what seemed like an eternity, the wind screaming like a banshee, interrupted by the horrific smashes of falling trees and the grinding screech of metal on metal. Then, amid the chaos, a new sound emerged. It began gently, with a low, sorrowful tone that seemed to thread itself into the fabric of the wind. At first, I assumed it was simply the storm playing tricks on my ears. But Darby tensed next me. "Do you hear that?" she said quietly, her voice tense. "Hear what?" Finn snapped, his voice filled with tension. "Singing," she inhaled. "Someone singing." And she was correct. The music was clearer now, a choir of high, ghostly voices that rose and fell with the breeze. It was gorgeous, eerie, and completely unnatural. Mr. Hayes, face pallid and drawn, made the sign of the cross. "Lord, have mercy," he whispered, the siren's call. We gazed at him, horror turning to uncertainty. "What are you talking about?" I inquired, my voice wavering. He shook his head, his eyes filled with an odd combination of dread and resignation. "An old sailor's tale," he said. "They say that when a storm is at its worst, when the water takes the most lives, you can hear them singing, luring the living to join them." His words shot shivers down my spine. The song appeared to get louder and more urgent, weaving its way into our thoughts and calling us. Darby clutched my hand, her eyes wide with fright. "We have to get out of here," she said quietly. "I can't take it anymore." "Don't be ridiculous," Finn murmured as his voice faltered. "We cannot go out there. It is suicide." But Darby was already struggling to her feet, her face pallid and her eyes glazed over. "I have to go," she whispered, her voice far away and trance-like. "They're calling me." She lurched towards the basement door, grasping for the latch. Mr. Hayes came at her, seizing her arm, his voice raspy. "Darby, no. Fight it," she battled with him, her strength startling. "Let me go," she exclaimed. "I have to go to them." The chanting reached a peak, with voices whirling about us, attempting to take us down into the darkness. I felt myself pulled in, my anxiety giving way to a weird sensation of need, a want to respond to the call. Suddenly, there was a tremendous bang above. The storm cellar rattled, with dust falling from the ceiling. Mr. Hayes, his expression gloomy, released Darby. "It's too late," he remarked, his voice full of sadness. "The storm's got her." He drew us aside from the entrance as Darby, her eyes empty and her lips moving soundlessly, moved towards the source of the song, the core of the storm. We never saw her again. The storm gradually passed, leaving a path of destruction and a calm more horrifying than the sound of the wind. They never discovered Darby's corpse. Others claim she was swept out to sea, another victim of Celia's fury. But I understand the reality. I heard the siren's call and felt a tug on my own spirit. And I know Darby is not lost at sea. She's someplace under the waters, eternally linked to the storm and singing its fatal song. Story 3. The rain began slowly, a pleasant drizzle that gave us a false feeling of security. It was simply another Tuesday during the hurricane season in Louisiana. However, this was not just ordinary storm. This was Henri, and he was carrying the whole wrath of the Gulf with him. By evening, the rain had turned into a relentless deluge, with the wind howling like a monster through the big oak trees that bordered our street. We lived in Houma, a stone's throw from the bayou, and the water was rising quickly. My grandfather, a weathered old Cajun with eyes that had seen more hurricanes than I could remember, began mumbling about the levees and how they wouldn't hold. "The bayou, she's angry," he'd remark, his voice hoarse from age and concern. "She's gonna claim what's hers." We didn't listen. We were young and invincible. We have withstood hurricanes before. What was one more? We were mistaken. The levees collapsed just after midnight. A loud roar interrupted the night, followed by the terrible sound of rushing water. We climbed onto the top of our one-story home, water already lapping at our heels. The rain was blinding, and the wind whipped it into our faces, taking away our breath. My parents, my younger sister Callie, Grandpappy and I crowded together, clinging to each other, the roof, and the final glimmer of hope that was swiftly fading. As the night progressed, the water rose, devouring the recognizable features of our area. Houses vanished under the murky water, their roofs bobbing like discarded toys. And then we saw them. At first, they were just shadows in the water, black figures swimming against the stream. But when they moved closer, we could see them better. They were not human. They resembled nightmares, with bloated and pallid bodies and dark, hollow eyes. Some resembled humans, while others were horrible caricatures of marine animals. They glided with unsettling ease, their limbs trailing in the water like seaweed. "Share," Grandpappy said softly, his voice shaking. "The Rugaru. They came." The Rugaru. Swamp devils, monsters from Cajun tradition, are thought to prey on the wicked and naive. We always assumed they were simply stories meant to terrify youngsters. We were mistaken. The beasts circled our little island of sanctuary, their gaze locked on us, and their mouths wide in silent, ravenous cries. The odor of rotting permeated the air, stifling us and robbing our breath. One of the monsters, its body a bizarre mix of human and fish, surged toward the roof, its claws wrapping across the tiles. We rushed back, our shouts drowned out by the thunder of the storm. Grandpappy, his eyes burning with an odd light, snatched a loose shingle and brandished it at the thing. "Back, demon!" he yelled, his voice surprisingly powerful. "You ain't taking my family." The monster paused, head inclined to the side, as if contemplating his remarks. Then, with a hiss, it returned to the water, sinking under the murky surface. The others followed, fading into the darkness, their screams resonating in our ears long after they had vanished. We remained on the roof for what seemed like an eternity, the storm screaming around us, monsters hiding in the water below. When the sun eventually rose, coloring the sky in purple and orange, it seemed like a miracle. The floods gradually retreated, exposing a world changed. Our home was gone, reduced to a mass of rubble. Our neighborhood, life, and all we knew were wiped away. We were rescued by a Coast Guard helicopter and flown to safety. We were fortunate to be alive. But the memory of that night, the sight of those animals, the stench of decay, the horror in their eyes, lingered with us. She had taken her rightful place in the bayou, and she had taught us that certain stories, murmured in hushed tones over crackling flames, are better left alone. Story 4. The air crackled with expectancy, and the aroma of ozone hung in the air. We were tracking Hurricane Thaddeus, a massive storm raging over the Texas Panhandle. For the Storm Riders crew, it was more than a job. It was a passion. We want the adrenaline rush, the sheer might of nature unleashed. There were 4 of us in the armored pursuit vehicle: myself, Zeke, our driver and resident daredevil, Maggie, our meteorologist, her eyes fixed to the radar screen, and Silas, our videographer, who was always looking for the best photo. We were a family, united by our mutual love of the storm. Thaddeus was unusual. It wasn't simply the size or intensity, it was a monster by any measure. It was something more, something we couldn't quite identify. "This one feels alive," Maggie had murmured earlier, her voice quiet as she watched the whirling patterns on the radar. We laughed it off at first, but as we moved closer to the center of the storm, a sensation of worry overcame us. The wind seemed to whisper our names, and the lightning flashed with almost evil knowledge. We were pursuing the wall cloud, a towering mass of darkness stretching to the skies when it occurred. The wind, which had been a continuous roar, abruptly stopped, leaving an unsettling calm. The pursuit car lurched suddenly, as if hit by an unseen hand. "What the hell was that?" Zeke screamed, attempting to maintain control of the truck. Before anybody could respond, the radar screen went crazy. Static filled the display until a single picture flashed into view. It was a horrible and malformed visage, with eyes filled with an awful glow. Maggie gasped, bringing her palm to her lips. "It can't be." The visage on the television spoke, with a deep growl that seemed to reverberate in our bones. "You should not have chased me," it hissed, its words laced with hatred. "You've reawakened something old and strong. Andy, now it will consume you." Panic spread across the car. Zeke pressed his foot on the accelerator, but it wasn't effective. The pursuit car was seized in an unseen grasp and lifted off the ground like a toy. We yelled, but our cries were drowned out by the raging wind. The pursuing car swirled furiously, flung about like a leaf in a whirlwind. Through the windshield I saw it, a spinning vortex of black clouds with a gaping mouth of fangs and lightning at the center. It was the same visage as on the radar screen, but it was alive and ravenous. The pursuit vehicle was drawn closer, its metal groaning under the pressure. Maggie's face became pale with panic as I caught her sight. We both knew this was it, the end of the journey. The last thing I remember was a bright flash of light, followed by complete darkness. Days later, they discovered the wreckage of the pursuing vehicle, which was damaged and twisted beyond recognition. Our remains were never found. Some believe we were just unfortunate, caught in a weird weather occurrence. But I understand the reality. We had stumbled onto something old, wicked, and that should have been left alone. We pursued the storm, and it chased us back. Story 5. The high school gymnasium reeked of perspiration, anxiety, and stale disinfection. Hurricane Opal was rushing down on Mobile, Alabama, and we were crammed together like sardines, seeking shelter from the storm's fury. Cots ringed the basketball court, crowded with families cuddled together, their faces highlighted by the flickering fluorescent lighting. I was there with my mom and my younger brother, Toby. We were fortunate to acquire a place. The shelter was full, with people squeezed into every available space. The tension was apparent, a subtle hum of apprehension resonating around the room. As the night progressed, the storm raged outside, the wind screaming like a banshee and the structure trembling beneath the force. Toby was afraid, his little fingers grabbing me with unexpected vigor. "Don't worry, baby brother," I said quietly, attempting to sound braver than I felt. "It's just a little breeze. You're safe in here." But as I said, a shudder shot down my spine. Something felt strange, incorrect. It wasn't simply the storm, something lurked in the shadows. It began quietly. A low growl from the far end of the gym, misinterpreted as a dog whining. A quick sight of something moving in the rafters, dismissed as a lighting illusion. Then people began vanishing. It started with Mrs. Landry, an old lady who lived down the street. One minute she was hunched in her wheelchair, the next she was gone, her chair overturned and a solitary slipper on the floor. Then it was Mr. Henderson's kid, Timmy, who was abducted from his cradle as his parents slept. A collective cry echoed around the bunker, terror turning to panic. The rumors began, spreading like wildfire across the scared audience. Something's taking them. It's the Rugaru come up from the Bayou. We're trapped in here with it. The lights flickered again, leaving the gym in darkness. Screams flooded the air, as did the sound of children wailing in desperate pleas. And then I saw it. A creature shifts in the darkness, its eyes shining with an unusual light. It glided with a fluid elegance that was both beautiful and horrifying, its shape rippling and shifting, like those it had stolen. It was a shapeshifter, a predator that fed on our dread. I grabbed Toby and pulled him close, my heart racing in my chest. We needed to get out of there, away from the horror that was happening around us. I saw an escape door, a glint of light in the darkness. "Come on, Toby," I growled, tugging him along. "Run." We sprinted, evading terrified folks, our breath caught in our throats. The beast was behind us. We could hear its deep breathing and smell the rot that clung to it. We dashed out the escape door into the raging storm. The wind ripped at us. The rain stung our cheeks, but we refused to stop. We ran till our lungs burned, and our legs cried for mercy. We sought refuge in an abandoned automobile, gathered together, listening to the storm scream around us. We weren't sure if we were safe, but we were alive. The storm passed the following morning, leaving a path of destruction and a calm more horrifying than the sound of the wind. The shelter was vacant, with the doors wide open, as if whatever was confined within had been freed. They never located the missing individuals. Some said they were washed away by the storm surge and lost at sea. But I understand the reality. I saw the thing, felt its breath on my neck, and saw the hunger in its eyes. We were stuck in a hellish bunker, and some of us never made it out. Story 6. The air was heavy with the scent of pine needles and terror. Hurricane Iris was sweeping over the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, unleashing a fury unlike anything I'd ever seen. I was locked up in my grandfather's cabin, a solid log home hidden deep in the woods and miles from the closest town. Grandpappy, a guy who'd been through more storms than years on this planet, had constantly cautioned me about hurricanes in the highlands. "It ain't the wind or the rain you gotta worry about, boy," he'd remark, his voice gruff with age and knowledge. "It's what the wind carries." I was about to discover how correct he was. The wind howled outside, a huge, unyielding force that appeared destined to rip the planet apart. The trees bent low, their branches scratching the ceiling like skeleton fingers. Rain pelted the boarded-up windows, causing the cabin's foundations to shake. I was alone, my phone was useless, and the electricity lines were down for miles around. The storm had sealed me off from the outer world, leaving me with just the roaring wind and a mounting sensation of dread in my gut. It began quietly, a whisper at the edge of my hearing, a voice borne by the wind. I disregarded it at first, thinking it was the storm's intensity playing tricks on my head, but the voices continued, becoming louder and more forceful. They were words I couldn't comprehend in any language spoken by humans. They were guttural, primordial noises, infused with a cold, alien desire. And then the dreams started. Vivid, horrible dreams that left me gasping for breath and my bedding wet in cold perspiration. I dreamed of swirling black clouds, eyes that burned with an unnatural brightness, and voices that promised power while whispering of annihilation. I struggled to remain awake, resisting the fatigue that was pulling at me, but it was futile. The murmurs permeated my waking hours, blurring the boundary between dream and reality until I couldn't tell the difference. One night, while the storm raged outside, I awoke from a particularly vivid nightmare to find the cabin unusually quiet. The wind had tapered down, and the rain was reduced to a quiet patter on the roof. Relief flooded over me, followed by a wave of disorientation so severe that I staggered, my palm grabbing the wall to keep me steady. And then I saw them, silhouettes in the darkness, their shapes altering and forming from the shadows. They were tall and slim, with extended limbs and flowing motions that were unnerving. Their eyes, filled with a cold, white light, penetrated into me, removing my dread and leaving me empty and cold. The voices became louder, whirling around me and piercing my thoughts, their meaning becoming frighteningly evident. They were the Windborn, ancient beings who rode the storm, preying on the terror and despair of those trapped in their wake. They gave power and whispered promises of immortality, but the cost was oblivion, the sacrifice of your soul. I attempted to yell and fight back, but my body was immobilized, refusing to follow my directions. The Windborn drew closer, their bodies shimmering and their gaze blazing into me. I felt a coldness permeate through me, a terrible emptiness seeping into my bones, blood, and very existence. I was being hollowed out, consumed by the things that surrounded me. Just when I believed all hope was gone, a voice broke through the darkness. "Leave him be." Grandpappy's voice was packed with power and wrath like I'd never heard before. The Windborn turned, their gaze attracted to the entryway where Grandpappy stood, his weathered face carved with anger and his shotgun grasped in quivering hands. "This one's mine," he said, his voice raspy but firm. "You ain't taking him." A burst of light flooded the cabin, and the shotgun's scream echoed across the cramped area. The Windborn screamed, their shapes flickering, and their grip on me loosened. I sank on the floor, my body trembling and the coldness fading like a wave. When I glanced up, the Windborn had fled into the darkness, just as swiftly as they emerged. Grandpappy lying on the floor, chest motionless and eyes closed. He had rescued me, sacrificing himself to the Windborn to keep me safe from their grasp. The storm roared outside, but there was complete quiet inside the cabin, a quiet filled with regret and thankfulness, as well as the sobering realization that certain things once seen cannot be unseen. Story 7. The rain fell in sheets, a relentless torrent that seems intended to drown the earth. Hurricane Ingrid, a Category 4 monster, was sweeping across Galveston Island, Texas, and our little beach cottage was directly in her path. We'd evacuated, of course, along with everyone else, or at least we tried. However, the storm surge arrived quicker than everyone predicted, trapping us on the island and shutting off our escape path. We were now gathered on the top of our 2-story home as the water rose rapidly around us. The wind howled like a banshee, ripping through our garments and tossing our hair over our faces. There were 5 of us, me, my parents, my younger sister Lily, and Sam, our aging Labrador retriever. We clung to one another, to the chimney, to the last glimmer of hope that was rapidly fading. The water was now up to our knees, chilly and murky, and littered with debris that brushed across our legs like invisible hands. The house moaned under us, its foundations buckling under the continuous onslaught of the seas. "We're running out of time," my father said, barely heard over the boom of the storm. "We need to find something to float on." But everything was gone. The surging waters had carried away the porch furniture, kayaks, and even the hefty picnic table. And then I saw it. A black thing bobbed in the water at the roof's edge. It was too large to be a piece of garbage, and too uniform to be a log. "What's that?" Lily wept and pointed to the shape. We all gazed, our hearts thumping in our chests, a wave of hope and terror flooding over us. As the shape got closer, we could see it better. It was a little damaged fishing boat with a scratched and torn hull that remained afloat. "Thank God," my mother muttered, her voice shaking in relief. But when the boat collided with the edge of the roof, a fresh surge of horror poured over me. There was something within. It was not human. It was a beast, sleek and black, with eyes that glowed with an eerie brilliance in the stormy darkness. It glided with a sinuous fluidity that was both beautiful and horrifying, its long, muscular limbs pushing it through the water effortlessly. It locked its sight on us, its eyes icy and calculating. We were stuck, marooned on our dwindling island of sanctuary with a predator lurking below. The beast let out a deep growl, sending chills down my spine. It was ravenous, and we were the only prey in sight. My father grabbed a stray shingle off the roof and brandished it at the beast. "Get back!" he shouted, his voice raspy with dread. "Get away from my family!" The monster paused, head inclined to the side, as if contemplating his remarks. Then, with one flick of its tail, it vanished under the sea. We held our breath, staring at the area where the monster had gone. The minutes seemed to drag on forever, with each second being an excruciating tick of the clock. The water continued to rise, lapping at our chests and threatening to take us down into the dark depths. And then we heard it, a scratching sound like claws on wood. The beast was back. It had made its way onto the roof. We gathered together, backs against the chimney, eyes wide with fear. The thing approached us, its body low to the earth, and its eyes never leaving ours. We were about to perish, and suddenly there was a miracle. A Coast Guard aircraft screamed above, its lights shining through the darkness and revealing our perilous predicament. The monster, startled by the startling brightness and commotion, halted, its focus temporarily distracted. That was all the time we needed. The chopper dropped a rescue basket, and one by one, we were taken off the roof, away from the storm, the beast, and certain death. As we were pulled into the air, I glanced back at the roof. The thing was gone, but I knew deep down that it was still out there, somewhere in the stormy seas, waiting for its next meal, waiting for the next naive victim to be marooned. Story 8. The air seemed thick and motionless, with humidity pressing down like a stifling blanket. Everyone referred to it as the calm before the storm. Hurricane Joaquin was churning up the Atlantic, with its eyes set on the little village of Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. However, it was not the storm that had us on edge. It was the stillness. The ocean, normally a symphony of crashing waves and bird calls, lay strangely still, a sheet of black glass reflecting the scarred purple sky. The wind, which was usually a continuous presence on the outer banks, had fled, leaving a disconcerting silence in its wake. Even the birds seemed to have left, with their customary chirping replaced by an unsettling hush. "Something's not right," my grandmother, Nana Rose, whispered, her voice tense with concern. She had spent her whole life on Hatteras Island, survived several hurricanes, and her instincts were seldom incorrect. We were gathered in her old rambling seaside home, with the windows boarded up and food stored, waiting for Joaquin to unleash his wrath. I was with my younger brother Caleb, my parents, and Nana Rose, her weathered face carved with a fear I'd never seen before. It began quietly, a sequence of bizarre happenings, readily disregarded as nerves fraying under the weight of the approaching storm. The radio set to the weather station would crackle and spit static, only to be replaced by a chorus of murmurs that were too low and garbled to be understood. The dogs, who are typically noisy and lively, whimpered and paced, their hackles up and their gaze riveted on invisible objects in the shadows. And then, the dreams began. Vivid, scary nightmares haunted us all, leaving us waking up in cold sweats with our hearts racing in our chest. Dreams of swirling black water, eyes that shone with an unusual light, and voices that muttered our names with sickening familiarity. "It's the island," Nana Rose murmured one evening, her voice scarcely audible as she looked out at the unsettlingly peaceful water. "She is restless, angry." We chuckled, of course, dismissing her statements as the ramblings of an elderly lady. But deep down, a seed of uneasiness had been sown. The next day, events took a terrible turn. Caleb, while playing in the backyard, claimed to have seen a person standing at the edge of the woods, its appearance concealed by the shadows cast by the live oak trees. He described it as tall and slim, with long, spidery fingers and eyes that shone like flames in the dim light. We disregarded it as a child's fantasy, but Caleb, who is often brave, hesitated to walk outdoors alone again. That night, the voices on the radio were louder and more persistent. We crowded around the ancient appliance, our faces lighted by its feeble glow, listening as the voices seemed to combine into a single frightening message. Turn back, while you still can. Fear, cold and primitive, grabbed all of us. We were no longer dealing with a single storm. Something else was at work, something old and terrible, lurking under the surface of our world, waiting for the perfect opportunity to burst free. The next morning, the storm struck. But it was not the storm we had anticipated. The wind howled, but it wasn't the typical roar of a hurricane. It was a high-pitched, keening howl, like to a chorus of lost souls. The rain came in sheets, but it wasn't water that pelted the windows. It was a thick, oily material that stuck to the glass, creating a curtain of blackness over the outside world. The figures emerged from the water, tall and skeletal, their skin stretched tight over their bones, and their eyes shone with an eerie interior light. They moved with strange elegance, their long limbs carrying them over the storm-tossed countryside as if they were walking on air. They encircled the home, their icy, vacant stares fastened on us through the boarded-up windows. We gathered together, our horror palpable in the little space, as the monsters of our dreams, the storm's harbingers, closed in. The island has spoken, and it hadn't arrived to rescue us. Story 9. The air was heavy with a scent of salt and impending doom. Hurricane Clara, a Category 3 giant, was barreling towards Savannah, Georgia, with a direct impact on our ancient, low-lying city. Evacuation orders had been issued, but my grandpa, a stubborn old man firmly attached to his roots, refused to go. "This house has weathered worse," he said firmly, despite the quiver in his palm. He was referring to the great old Victorian estate we lived in, a bygone-age relic situated perilously on the banks of the Savannah River. I remained with him out of a sense of obligation and morbid curiosity. As the storm raged outside, the wind howled like an angry ghost. I couldn't escape the impression that we weren't simply dealing with nature's fury, but something much more evil. It began quietly. A glimpse of movement in the mirror of a darkened window, a whisper of my name borne by the wind, a chilly spot that followed me from room to room. Then the nightmares started. Dreams were vivid and terrible, leaving me gasping for breath and my blankets wet in cold perspiration. I had a dream about a lady, her face veiled by shadows and her eyes glowing with a cold, vengeful fire. She talked of treachery, unmet debts, and an impending reckoning. When I informed my grandpa about the nightmares, he became curiously silent, his gaze far away, with a spark of terror in his normally stern eyes. "It's her," he said, barely heard above the raging wind. "She's come back." He declined to expand, dismissing my queries with vague statements about previous misdeeds and the cost of forgiveness. But I felt deep down that he was concealing something related to the lady in my nightmares, something that made him terrified and chilled me to the bone. As the storm raged on, odd incidents became more frequent. The portraits on the walls slanted, and their eyes seemed to follow me as I strolled around the home. Even though I was positive I was alone, the floorboards creaked underfoot, and the murmurs, always the whispers, followed me like shadows. becoming louder and more forceful, as if the walls themselves were attempting to warn me. Then the electricity went out, leaving the home in darkness. I groped for a lantern, my pulse racing and the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. As I lighted the flame and sent a flickering illumination over the room, I saw her. She stood at the foot of the steps, her shape shimmering in the faint light, her features gradually coming into focus. She was gorgeous in a haunting, ethereal manner, with pale skin like moonlight and eyes that burned with an otherworldly brightness. But her face froze me to the bone. Her face distorted with pure, unadulterated anger, her lips twisted into a wicked sneer, and her eyes blazed with a wrath that threatened to swallow her. "You!" she screamed, her voice a scratchy whisper that seemed to claw its way up from deep inside my soul. "You will pay for what he did." Terror fixed me to the place, and my breath froze in my mouth as she moved towards me, fluid and elegant, like a creature stalking its victim. I knew, with a surety that defied sense, that she wasn't there for me. She was here for my grandpa, for a debt he owed, a transgression he had done, and a wrong he could never undo. And I was caught in the crossfire. The house creaked around us, and the wind howled like a banshee as the storm raged on. I closed my eyes, prepared for the impending reckoning, but it never arrived. When I opened my eyes, she was gone. The storm raged for a few more hours before ultimately fading, leaving a path of devastation and a quiet more horrifying than the sound of the wind. My grandpa arrived from his study with a pallid face and troubled eyes. He never talked of what he had seen or what had happened during those dark hours, but I knew deep down that he had faced the repercussions of his actions and paid the price for his transgressions. And I was left with the unsettling understanding that certain storms are not the result of nature's wrath, but the echoes of our worst crimes returning to take their rightful place. Story 10. The air crackled with static, and the sky was a whirling vortex of furious gray clouds. Hurricane Isabel was ripping into our little town on the Florida Panhandle, unleashing a fury unlike anything I had ever seen. The wind howled like a banshee, ripping at the roof of our little frame home and threatening to take it off completely. I was 8 years old, crouched in the relative protection of the storm cellar with my family, the sound of the wind a persistent, frightening presence. My mother, heavily pregnant with my younger brother, gripped my hand, her face wan but determined. Then the electricity went out, leaving us in darkness. A collective cry echoed across the small confines, followed by my mother's rapid intake of air. "It's time," she said quietly, her voice full of anxiety and eagerness. My father, his expression filled with concern, assisted her to her feet. "I'll get the lantern," he murmured in a strained voice. Unfortunately, it was too late. A brilliant burst of light, greater than any lightning I'd ever seen, lit up the basement for a short, scary instant. It was not the storm. It was coming from my mother. Her raw and primal scream resonated across the tiny area as the light grew brighter, surrounding her in a dazzling white glow. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. Silence fell, thick and profound, interrupted only by the sound of my own strained breathing. My father struggled for the lamp, his hands quivering and his face pale in the flickering light. My mother lay on the dirt floor with her eyes closed, her chest rising and falling in a regular cadence. In her arms, she held a newborn baby boy. My brother Daniel was born in the middle of a storm. We quickly realized Daniel was unusual. It wasn't only his incredible ability to sleep through the most intense thunderclaps or his peculiar fixation with the weather. It was something more, something that sent chills down my spine and filled me with both amazement and horror. Daniel's abilities increased as he developed. He could call down rain with a flick of his wrist, create small tornadoes in the garden, and his laughing appeared to draw lightning strikes with unsettling precision. At first, it was simply harmless fun, juvenile pranks that made us laugh and shake our heads in surprise. But as Daniel got older, his abilities became more erratic and volatile. On a hot summer day when Daniel was 10, we were playing baseball at the park. The game was competitive throughout, with the score knotted at the bottom of the 9th inning. Daniel was at bat, his face a mask of intense focus. I was throwing, and I gave him a fastball to the outside corner. He swung and missed. However, instead of the pleasant crack of the bat hitting the ball, there came a loud boom of thunder. The sky, which was once a bright, brilliant blue, had turned an alarming hue of green. The wind rose up and swirled about Daniel, tossing his hair over his face. He stood there, bat in hand, a peculiar grin on his lips, while the wind became stronger, producing a funnel cloud right over the baseball field. Panic spread across the park as people yelled and raced for safety. "Daniel," I yelled, my voice barely heard over the fury of the wind. "Stop it! You're frightening everyone!" He gazed at me, his eyes gleaming with an unusual light, and for a scary moment, I saw a stranger gazing back at me, a creature of great strength and unpredictable hatred. Then, as swiftly as it started, it ended. The wind eased down, the clouds cleared, and the sun shone through, throwing a warm warmth on the scene of near anarchy. Daniel dropped the bat, his face pallid, his eyes wide with terror and uncertainty. I didn't mean to," he said, his voice shaking, but the harm had been done. The encounter in the park marked a turning point. People muttered about Daniel, their eyes filled with dread and distrust. He became an outcast, a pariah in his own community. My parents were anxious to save their kid, so they brought him to doctors, therapists, and even a priest. However, no one could understand Daniel's abilities or how to regulate them. They say he was born during a storm, a force of nature, as unpredictable and uncontrolled as the storms that gave birth to him. Daniel withdrew more inside himself over time, his abilities becoming more powerful and dangerous. He couldn't control the storms that raged inside him, and I was always afraid of what he might unleash next. He was my brother, but he was also a continuous reminder of nature's tremendous power and the thin line that divides humans from the forces that control our planet. Story 11. Hurricane Elias, a Category 5 monster churning up the Atlantic, wreaked havoc on the aging lighthouse. Rain lashed against the thick glass of the lantern chamber, and the wind howled like a banshee, attempting to knock the light from its perch. I spent nearly 50 years with my grandpa, Silas, the Cape Fear lighthouse keeper. He was a grizzled old salt, his face worn by the sea and engraved with tales from 1,000 hurricanes. But tonight, dread flashed in his eyes, something I'd never seen before. "It's calling," he said, his voice scarcely heard above the storm's roar. He grabbed an old leather-bound book with fading writing and weird markings on the pages. "What's calling, Grandpa?" I inquired, my voice tight with the terror I couldn't quite identify. He extended a gnarled finger toward the surging water, towards the center of the storm. "The Leviathan," he murmured, his voice raspy from fear. "The storm has awakened it," I scoffed, despite the uneasiness in my belly. "What about the Leviathan? A mythological sea monster or a creature of legend?" It was only an old sailor's tale, intended to terrify youngsters. But the expression in my grandfather's eyes told me he believed it. And that frightened me more than any storm could. He flicked over the pages of the book, his brow wrinkled with concentration. "The light," he mumbled. "It must remain illuminated. It's the only thing keeping it in check." He was referring to the lighthouse beam, which shone brightly through the darkness, serving as a beacon of hope for seafarers stranded at sea. But tonight, it seemed like something more, a barrier against a basic darkness I was just starting to understand. The storm continued on, with each smashing wave and roaring gust of wind appearing to rock the lighthouse to its foundation. And then I heard it, a sound that transcended description, a guttural growl that appeared to erupt from the depths of the ocean, shaking the world's foundations. My grandpa tightened his grasp on my arm, his knuckles white as bone. "It's here," he said quietly, his voice full of terrifying conviction. I looked out into the storm-tossed darkness, my pulse thumping in my chest. At first, I just saw the surging water and the blinding rain. And then I saw it. An enormous and black figure emerges from the depths, highlighted by lightning bolts. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen, a nightmarish monster with shimmering obsidian scales and eyes that shone with an odd, evil radiance. The Leviathan. It circled the lighthouse, its huge bulk churning the water, and its roar ringing over the stormy sea. My grandpa sprung into action, his anxiety replaced by steely purpose. He snatched a flare rifle off the wall, loaded it with shaky hands and pointed it at the thing. "Turn back, beast!" he screamed, his voice unusually powerful for his age. "This light protects these waters," he fired. The flare erupted into the night sky, leaving a slash of crimson against the whirling grey clouds. It detonated over the Leviathan, showering the beast with sparkles. The beast shouted again, its rage evident, before charging towards the lighthouse. I prepared myself for collision in the end. But the lighthouse held. The Leviathan, its vast bulk lit by the beam, crashed into the structure's base, shaking the tower to its core. It attacked repeatedly, its anger mimicking the storms. My grandpa, his face pallid but determined, continued to shoot flares, each one a bold gesture of defiance against the thing from the depths. Then, as swiftly as it started, it ended. With a last ear-splitting roar, the Leviathan fled into the depths, vanishing under the waters. The storm went on for a few more hours before eventually diminishing, leaving a path of damage and an unsettling but comforting stillness. My grandpa, his face etched with fatigue, leaned against the wall, his chest heaving. "It's gone," I said softly, my voice shaking with relief. He nodded, a long, tired grin growing over his lips. "For now," he replied, his voice hoarse. "But the light must constantly be burning. Tea is the only thing that keeps the darkness at bay." I gazed out at the tranquil water, the first rays of dawn coloring the sky in pink and orange. The storm had passed, but the memory of the Leviathan, the thing from the deep, would live on in my imagination as a terrible reminder of the old primeval powers that lie under our planet's surface. Story 12. The air was heavy with the stench of salt and decay, and the beach was covered with Hurricane Nadine's wreckage. Driftwood, tangled fishing nets, and the odd fragment of a person's life were strewn over the beach like abandoned toys. I've always been a beachcomber, drawn to the tranquility of the beach, the rhythmic crash of the waves, and the pleasure of uncovering hidden treasures left by the sea. But after Nadine, the beach carried a new allure, morbid curiosity mingled with the chance of discovering something worthwhile among the rubble. It was on the third day following the storm, with the sun a faint ghost behind the departing clouds, when I discovered it. A chest lay half buried on the beach, glinting dimly behind a tangle of seaweed. Not your average pirate loot chest, but rather a modest decorative piece made of dark polished wood. It was hefty, unexpectedly so, and fastened with tarnished metal clasps that seemed to mutter warnings as I pushed them open. Inside, resting on a bed of fading velvet, a solitary object, a mirror. However, this is no ordinary mirror. This one was spherical, with a frame made of the same dark wood as the chest and engraved with odd patterns that seemed to writhe and move as I looked at them. The mirror's surface was not glass, but rather a whirling, obsidian-like material that seemed to pull light from the surrounding air. I should have left it buried in the sand. That was something I understood deep down inside. But curiosity, that ravenous itch, got the best of me. I removed the mirror from its velvet cradle, the metal cool and curiously slippery on my fingertips. As I held it up, the symbols on the frame pulsed with a faint internal light, sending a shudder down my spine. The world around me seemed to twist and distort, with the usual noises of the beach replaced by a low humming sound that seemed to come from the mirror itself. And then I saw it. A visage stared back at me from inside the mirror's depths. It was not my own. It was a monster of nightmares, its skin pulled tight over a skull-like visage, its eyes gleaming with a cold, malicious intellect. Its mouth, a gaping maw packed with needle-like fangs, expanded into a horrifying smile that sent chills down my spine. I dropped the mirror, my stomach twisting with a primordial horror I had never experienced. It hit the sand with a bang, the obsidian surface undulating like a disturbed puddle of oil. But the visage persisted, its eyes fixed on mine, searing into my soul with a hunger that went beyond the physical reality. I fell back, my breath seizing in my throat, and my thoughts swirling at the sheer wrongness of the situation. The buzzing became louder, and the air around me became heavier, charged with an invisible force that cracked on my flesh, and then the world erupted. I don't recall precisely what occurred next. It was a swirl of dread and uncertainty, with bizarre, changing landscapes and monsters beyond description. I was stuck in a maze of lunacy, the lines between reality blurring, my sanity hanging by a thread. Days later, I awoke in a hospital bed, my body beaten and bruised, my mind jumbled with disjointed memories and dreams that refused to stop. They informed me that I'd been discovered walking on the beach, crazy and shouting about monsters and mirrors. They claimed I was fortunate to be alive, that the storm surge must have carried me away and placed me farther down the shore. But I knew the truth. I peered into the abyss, and it looked back. The mirror, that cursed item of some ancient terror, had opened a gateway, a passage to a world of darkness hidden just beyond the curtain of our reality. And I, a simple beachcomber, had been dumb enough to open it. The physicians referred to it as post-traumatic stress disorder, or the ramblings of a man who had faced death. But I knew better. The dreams persisted, the visage in the mirror haunting my waking hours, a persistent reminder of the cost of inquiry, the horrible realization that certain things are better left buried and unexplored. I never returned to the beach after Nadine. The water, which had once provided me with consolation and amazement, now filled me with primeval fear, a terrible feeling that the abyss was still watching, waiting for the opportunity to seize me and pull me down into its depths. And occasionally, in the middle of night, when the wind howled like a banshee and the rain lashed against my window pane, I could almost hear the humming, the whispering of the monsters from beyond, calling me back to the beach, back to the nightmare I could never completely escape. Story 13. The air was thick and humid, with the smell of salt and oncoming rain clinging to everything. It was June, the beginning of hurricane season on Dolphin Island, Alabama sliver of land clinging to the Gulf of Mexico's coast. We were used to storms, of course. They were as much a part of the island's ecosystem as the tides and seagulls. Something seemed different this year, however. It wasn't simply the gloomy hush that had descended on the island. The seagulls had fled, their screams replaced by an eerie quiet. It was a sense, a fundamental discomfort that enveloped the island like a veil. My grandpa, a weathered old fisherman who claimed to be able to detect a hurricane days before the weathermen could, referred to it as a haint wind. A breeze conveyed whispers of things unseen, old, forgotten, and better left alone. He was correct. The season's first hurricane, Arlene, was a very small storm that arrived on Tuesday afternoon. The wind and rain were not exceptional, albeit they were both intense. This was what occurred during the storm, as the sky became an ugly green and the wind howled like a banshee. People began to notice strange occurrences, strange, flickering lights in the sky, shadows moving against storm-tossed waves, and persons visible through rain-streaked windows. Most rejected it as light-induced hallucinations caused by anxiety and tiredness. However, the murmurs began, spreading like wildfire across the island's tiny, close-knit population. Something came ashore with the storm. They're watching US. They're waiting. The following storm, Barry, came just 2 weeks later, larger and more damaging than its predecessor. This time, sightings were more frequent and alarming. Fishermen reported seeing huge forms moving under their boats, and their nets torn apart by invisible claws. Families hiding in their houses claimed to have seen bright eyes looking through their boarded-up windows, and the air outside was filled with murmurs in a language they didn't understand but could feel in their bones. The whole island was in a frenzy. People were terrified to leave their houses, fearful of what they could see and what may await them in the stormy darkness. My grandfather's stern expression and eyes, full with knowledge that chilled me to the bone, verified our darkest suspicions. "It's a cycle," he said, his voice hoarse with age and fear. "They arrive with the storms each year. They feed on our dread and sorrow. And then, after the storms pass, they vanish into the water, waiting for the next hurricane season." He refused to utter anything further, his lips locked together in a rigid line. But deep inside, I believed he knew more than he was revealing. He understood what these beings were, where they came from, and what they want. And this awareness scared him. The third storm of the season, Chantal, was a monster. A Category 5 giant smashed into Dolphin Island with the fury of a nuclear weapon. We crouched in our storm basement, the wind roaring like a tangible presence, the house groaning and cracking all around us. I could feel the terror, heavy and crushing, weighing down on us like a burden. And then the murmurs began. They were everywhere, encircling the home, seeping through the holes in the walls, and creeping into our heads like cold tendrils. They talked of surrender, forgetfulness, and a darkness that threatened to engulf us all. I slammed my eyes tight and wrapped my hands over my ears, attempting to drown out the horrible noises. But it was useless. The murmurs within my skull were chilly and evil, promising power and oblivion. I'm not sure how long it lasted, how long we weathered the storm and the murmurs that came with it. Time appeared to lose all significance, the bounds of reality blurred, and my sanity was hanging by a thread. When the storm passed, leaving a path of damage and a calm more horrifying than the roar of the wind, we emerged from the cellar to discover the island had changed. The old landmarks were gone, replaced by an unfamiliar alien world. The air buzzed with unseen energy, and the water shone with an unearthly phosphorescence. And the murmurs, while fainter now, persisted, a terrifying reminder of the animals that had washed up with the storm, creatures who had seized our island, our sanity, our very souls. The hurricane season was done, but the horror had just started. Story 14. The Oceanic Majesty cruise ship was meant to be a floating paradise, providing a week-long getaway from reality. Instead, it became a steel and glass prison, battered about by the fury of Hurricane Lorenzo, a Category 4 monster raging over the Caribbean. We were 3 days into our cruise when the storm came. The captain, his voice strained but comforting over the microphone, reminded us that the Oceanic Majesty was designed to resist everything Mother Nature might hurl at her. He was incorrect. The storm struck with force that surpassed description. The wind, a wailing, shrieking creature, tore into the ship, shredding rails, breaking glass, and throwing lifeboats like toys. The waves, towering walls of water, slammed over the deck, washing away everything that was not fastened down. We were confined to our quarters, the lights flickering irregularly and the ship's incessant moans sounding like a symphony of death. Fear, thick and stifling, pervaded the air, heightened by scared passengers' shouts and the unrelenting hammering of the storm. I heard it during a particularly powerful lurch, with the ship tipping perilously to one side. A scratching sound came from my cabin's balcony door. I approached the door with caution, my heart hammering. The wind howled outside, and the rain hit the glass like 1,000 little fists. I noticed it through the hazy, rain-streaked glass. A person clinging to the railing of my balcony, its form barely discernible against the stormy sky. The appearance was humanoid, but not quite right, with excessively lengthy limbs and fluid motions that seemed unnatural. Terror, cold and primitive, seized me. I staggered back from the door, my thoughts whirling. Was a crew member trapped in the storm? A fellow traveler driven insane by fear? But deep down, a sickening knowledge swept over me. It was something else. Something that did not fit aboard the Oceanic Majesty. Something that had sprung from the storm itself. The scratching became more intense, followed by a deep guttural snarl that seemed to reverberate through the ship's metal. I stepped away from the door, my eyes wide in dread, and my thoughts racing. I needed to find aid and notify the others. But as I struggled for the phone, the lights flickered and went, leaving the cottage in darkness. Panic washed over me, hot and smothering. I was imprisoned, alone in the darkness, with whatever waited beyond that door. The scratching has ceased. The cabin was eerily silent. And then I heard it. A quiet, wet thump, followed by a definite click when the balcony door unlocks. Something was within. I did not yell. I could not. Terror had silenced my voice, leaving me frozen with my breath locked in my chest. I could hear it moving in the darkness, slow and methodical, each one getting closer. The air became frigid, thick with the stink of saline and rot. And then I saw it. Two eyes appeared in the darkness, gleaming with an odd internal light, and their stare was locked on me with a hunger that went beyond the physical reality. I pressed my eyes tight, prepared myself for the inevitable. But it never arrived. The storm went on for another day and night before eventually diminishing, leaving a path of damage and an unsettling but comforting stillness. The Oceanic Majesty, shattered but afloat, staggered into dock, a ghost ship packed with frightened survivors. They never learned what happened to the missing passengers who disappeared during the storm. Some muttered of rogue waves, accidents, and terrified individuals being carried overboard. But I knew the truth. I saw the eyes in the darkness and felt the frigid breath of the wind on my flesh. That night, something old and wicked boarded the Oceanic Majesty, coming from the center of the storm. And it had wandered among us, unseen, claiming its victims, leaving behind only whispers of fear and the terrible awareness that's certain. Creatures are better left alone, lost to the depths from where they sprang. Story 15. The air was heavy with the odor of ozone and oncoming rain, and the sky above New Orleans was a bruised, sickly yellow. Hurricane Quinn, a slow-moving giant, was coming down on the city, threatening to unleash the full wrath of the Gulf on our defenseless streets. We were a bunch of urban explorers, thrill-seekers attracted to the city's secret arteries, the abandoned corners where darkness and history intersected. Tonight's destination was the famed Basin Street drain, a convoluted network of tunnels and canals under the French Quarter that is said to be haunted by the spirits of yellow fever sufferers, and worse. There were 4 of us, myself, Marcus, our brave leader and resident history buff, Chloe, our photographer, her camera always ready to capture the beauty and ruin of our urban playground, and Ben, our tech man, his bag stuffed with enough gadgets and gizmos to make NASA envy. We timed our descent to coincide with low tide, intending to investigate the drain's higher levels before the storm surge rendered it inaccessible. The air down there was thick and humid, with the odor of stagnant water and something else, old and organic, hanging to the back of my throat. "You ever get the feeling we're not alone down here?" Ben mumbled, his voice echoing strangely across the wet stone walls. "Just the ghosts of 1,000 dead pirates, Benny boy," Marcus remarked with a smile, his torch beam flashing over the graffiti-covered walls. "Don't tell me you're getting spooked." Ben chuckled, but I saw a flash of discomfort in his eyes. We all felt it, the stifling atmosphere, the feeling of being watched by invisible eyes. We continued on, further into the city's depths, the storm roaring above us, unconcerned about our underground expedition. The tunnels narrower, the air became colder, and the stink of rotting intensified. And then we heard it. A loud, guttural growl echoed from the darkness ahead, followed by the distinct sound of something moving, enormous and heavy. "What the hell was that?" Chloe muttered, her voice taut with anxiety that she couldn't quite conceal. Marcus, his confidence temporarily forgotten, raised his hand, indicating us to halt. "Quiet," he growled, "and keep your lights low." We snuggled close, our headlamps making flickering shadows on the tunnel walls and our breath echoing in the suffocating quiet. The roaring became louder and closer, followed by a repetitive splashing sound of something wading through shallow water. And then we saw it. Two eyes, gleaming with a strange interior brightness, appeared in the darkness ahead, their gaze fixated on us with a hunger that sent chills down my spine. The thing, which was plainly unlike any animal I had ever seen, walked into the light, its appearance ugly and frightening. It resembled a human, but its skin was slippery and hairless, and its limbs extended and twisted, terminating in claws that scratched against the concrete floor. It let out a hiss that seemed to ripple through the water that's surrounding us before taking a stride towards us. Panic spread among our little group. We ran back, our flashlights flashing furiously and our yells booming off the tunnel walls. "Run!" Marcus shouted, his voice quivering from dread. We did not need to be warned again. We turned and fled, our bags bouncing against our backs, our breath caught in our throats, and the creature's angry roars ringing behind us. The tunnels appeared to go on indefinitely, a labyrinthine horror with no exit. The air became thick and heavy, and the stink of rotting was nearly terrible. We eventually emerged into a vast circular room, with a storm drain opening above us like a gaping maw. Rain came in, flowing down the walls in deafening volume. However, there was no escape. The thing, with its remarkably swift movements, had cut us off, its brilliant eyes fastened on us with a predatory glitter. We gathered close, our backs against the chilly, wet wall, our flashlights flickering weakly in the face of the creature's strange glow. It moved slowly, enjoying our dread, its claws raking across the concrete floor, each stride a death sentence for our chances of escape. And suddenly, there was a miracle. The passage behind the beast resonated with a human, anxious voice. "Hey, over here. Oh, ugly son of a bitch." Distracted, the beast moved its head, diverting its focus for a minute. It was Ben. He stood at the tunnel's entrance, bag open, hands busily working on something within. "Ben, what are you doing?" Chloe yelled, her voice full with terror and bewilderment. "Distracting the damn thing," he screamed, his voice straining. "Now get the hell out of here." He touched a button on a gadget in his palm, and a dazzling burst of light illuminated the room. The beast shrieked in agony and wrath, its eyes temporarily blinded. That was all the time we needed. We did not hesitate. We struggled towards the storm drain entrance, the rain a welcome assault as we rose, pulling ourselves up into the storm-battered metropolis above. We did not look back. We never saw what happened to Ben. We never went back to the Basin Street drain. Some things, some monsters, are better left alone, lurking in the shadows, preying on the terror of those stupid enough to enter their realm. We'd learned a lesson. The city, particularly in the midst of storm season, harbored secrets best kept hidden. Story 16. The air was thick and silent, and the humidity pressed down on the Louisiana swamp like a stifling blanket. Hurricane Rita was churning towards the shore, a Category 5 monster threatening to unleash the full wrath of the Gulf on all in its path. But in the little secluded community of Bayou La Fourche, deep in the heart of the Atchafalaya Basin, terror was not limited to the coming storm. Another, more sinister peril lurked in the shadows, a horror that predates weather predictions and sent chills down the spines of even the most seasoned swamp inhabitants. It was the year of offering. Every generation, when the storms were at their most powerful and the bayou waters surged to seize the land, the whispering began. Whispers about an ancient covenant, a deal made between the early inhabitants and something ancient and strong that lurked under the dark depths. A contract that required a sacrifice. This year, the murmurs targeted my closest friend, Marie Thibodeau. Marie, with her long black hair and eyes that shone like the swamp, had always been unique. She was drawn to the water and spent her days wandering the marshes, talking to the alligators like old friends, her laughter booming through the cypress trees like a siren song. But recently, her laughter has been replaced by a gloomy quiet. Her eyes, once full of life and fun, now bore a frightening emptiness, reflecting the darkness that had seized her. It began quietly. Strange nightmares had her waking up in a cold sweat, her blankets coiled about her like a shroud. Her arms developed unexplained scrapes and thin crimson welts that dripped a brackish substance. And the voices, always the whispers, followed her like shadows, pulling her closer to the water's edge. Then the townspeople began behaving suspiciously. Their cheeks, usually worn and browned by the Louisiana heat, were pale and haggard, their eyes filled with terror and fanaticism. They chatted quietly, interspersed with cryptic declarations about ancient rites and the will of the bayou. My family, along with a handful of others, attempted to alert the authorities and reason with our neighbors. But it was useless. They were beyond reason, their brains corrupted by fear and superstition, and their souls surrendered to something terrible and old that ruled the marsh. The night Hurricane Rita hit shore, the townspeople gathered at the water's edge, their faces lighted by flickering torches and their eyes ablaze with a terrible fury. Marie, clad in a white gown with an ashen face and lifeless eyes, stood at the dock's edge, her hand grasped by a person enveloped in darkness. The figure, tall and gaunt, with its face shrouded by a hooded cloak, lifted its free hand, and the throng went silent. "The storm demands a sacrifice," the figure rasped, its voice a dry, scratchy whisper that seemed to come from deep inside the swamp itself. Life for life, soul for the storm. My blood became chilly. I knew, with a logic-defying certainty, that they were going to sacrifice Marie to the hurricane in order to placate whatever ancient evil lay under the storm-tossed waters. I couldn't allow them to do it. I pushed through the mob, my heart beating in my chest and my voice hoarse from fear and desperation. "Stop," I yelled. "This is madness. You can't do it." However, my appeals were unheard. The townspeople turned on me, their features distorted with rage and dread, their eyes glowing with a fervor that scared me to my core. "She's the chosen one," a lady screamed, her voice full with malice. "The bayou has spoken." The creature in the hooded cloak turned to face me, its stare piercing the darkness like a beacon of pure evil. "The offering has been chosen," it rasped, its voice a guttural growl that seemed to rock the earth under my feet. "Do not interfere with the will of the bayou." I realized then that I was waging a lost war. They were beyond logic, overwhelmed by dread and warped religion. I watched in horror as they carried Marie to the edge of the pier, her cries drowned out by the thunder of the impending cyclone. The figure in the hooded robe lifted its arms, and the wind appeared to respond, whipping the water into a frenzy and lighting up the sky above. Then they tossed her in. I did not witness what occurred next. I could not. I turned away, my stomach churning, tears flowing down my cheeks. The picture of Marie's horrified expression imprinted into my mind. The storm raged for days, reshaping the shoreline and leaving a path of damage in its wake. They never discovered Marie's corpse. Some speculated that the storm had snatched her, dragging her soul to the depths to placate the old evil that resided there. Others, their voices low and their eyes filled with a sickening conviction, said that she had transformed into something more than human, a monster of the storm, permanently bonded to the Bayou and the evil covenant that had seized her. I left Bayou La Fourche shortly after, unable to face the memories, murmurs and knowledge of what they had done. But the swamp and the horrors it contained pursued me. In my nightmares I can still hear Marie's cries, see the flickering flames, feel the suffocating weight of the humid air, and stare chillingly at the man in the hooded cloak. And I know deep down that the offering was not a one-time occurrence, but rather a cycle, a deal that would continue to demand a price, a soul for a storm. For as long as the Bayou ruled the hearts and minds of anyone brave enough to call it home. Story 17. Hurricane Omar wreaked havoc on our little fishing hamlet in the Florida Keys, leaving no one prepared. The storm had gone, leaving a path of destruction and a calm more horrifying than the sound of the wind. We were adrift, our little fishing boat, the Sea Star, bruised and shattered, flung about like a cork in the swirling, debris-filled sea. The storm surge had pulled us from our moorings, hurled us miles offshore, and swallowed our skipper, Old Man Jeb, whole. There were 4 of us left, myself, my elder brother Finn, our buddy and deckhand, Caleb, and Caleb's younger sister Sarah, whose eyes were wide with horror, mirroring mine. The sun hammered down on us, relentlessly and mercilessly. Our provisions had swept overboard by the storm's intensity. Thirst, gnawing and searing, clawed at my neck. "We need to find land," Finn remarked, his voice hoarse and his expression grimly determined. He looked across the horizon, but all I saw was a vast expanse of furious gray-green sea. Hope, a delicate thing in the face of such despair, flickered and threatened to perish. "There's something out there," Sarah muttered, her voice barely heard over the sound of waves crashing against the hull. She gripped a ragged piece of driftwood, her knuckles as white as bone. We ignored her statements as those of a fearful youngster. What else might be found in this watery wilderness than destruction and despair? But when the sun started its sluggish drop, painting the sky in bruised purple and blood orange, I saw it. A fin sliced across the water, surrounding our little boat. Not a playful dolphin's dorsal fin or a shark's sleek, threatening appearance. This fin was distinct. The surface of the larger, more ancient object was covered with barnacles and fur-like growths. Fear, icy and primordial, coils in my belly. "Finn," I said softly, my voice scratchy, "look." He followed my gaze, his face pale as he saw the fin circle closer, cutting through the water with an uncanny elegance that screamed of strength and a desire that chilled me to the bone. "Get down!" he yelled, shoving Sarah and me into the boat's little cabin, where we might be somewhat secure. We gathered together, breath caught in our throats, listening as the monster circled closer, its motions scarcely breaking the water's surface. The sun dropped beyond the horizon, leaving the world in darkness. A dense covering of storm clouds concealed the stars, which are often a source of comfort and guidance. We were alone, lost in a sea of darkness, pursued by something old and ravenous. A deep, guttural growl resonated over the ocean as if the earth were moaning in misery, and seemed to tremble through the very hull of the Sea Star. Then it struck us. The thing, its whole body still concealed under the waters, rammed into the boat with such ferocity that we were thrown about. The wood cracked, and the deck tilted perilously as water sloshed over the rails. Finn grabbed a gaff hook, his expression bleak and determined. "Get to the life raft," he cried, his voice barely heard over the crashing waves and the creature's angry screams. Caleb, his eyes wide with horror, rushed for the life raft, but it was too late. The beast lunged as its huge head broke the water's surface. It was a creature, a nightmare manifested. Its skin was a patchwork of scales and decaying flesh. Its eyes gleamed with a strange internal luminosity, and its jaws, packed with rows of razor-sharp teeth, gaped wide in a wordless scream. Caleb never had a chance. The thing scooped him up in its teeth, cutting off his cry as it vanished under the waters, leaving only a swirl of crimson water and an echo of our dread. Finn, his face ashen, pushed Sarah and me towards the life raft. "Go!" he yelled, his voice filled with pain and despair. "Get out of here." We did not hesitate. We climbed into the frail raft, grappling with the release catch. As we floated away, the beast reappeared, its fangs stained crimson and its eyes locked on us with a hunger that foretold a long, terrible death. But Finn stood between us, wielding the gaff hook like a weapon, his face a mask of resistance against the inevitable. "Get the hell out of here," he said, his voice a primal scream against the dimming light. "And don't you ever look back." We never saw him again. We were recovered 2 days later, clinging to the wreckage of the life raft, our bodies bruised and our minds torn. They didn't believe our narrative. They said it was only the storm, the madness of thirst and sadness. But we knew the truth. We had stared into the abyss, and it had stolen something from us that we would never get back. We were adrift, not only at sea, but in a world where monsters lurked under the waves, and our only hope was that they would never return to the surface. Story 18. Hurricane Omar wreaked devastation on our little fishing community in the Florida Keys, leaving no one prepared. The storm had passed, leaving a trail of devastation and a silence more terrifying than the roar of the wind. We were adrift, our little fishing boat, the Water Star, damaged and splintered, tossed about like a cork in the churning, debris-filled water. The storm surge had ripped us from our moorings, tossed us miles offshore, and swallowed our captain, Old Man Jeb, whole. There were just 4 of us left: me, my older brother Finn, our friend and deckhand, Caleb, and Caleb's younger sister Sarah, whose eyes were wide with dread, reflecting mine. The sun beat down on us fiercely and viciously. Our supplies had been washed overboard by the storm's might. Thirst, gnawing and scorching, clawed at my throat. "We need to find land," Finn said, his voice raspy and his face grimly resolute. He glanced across the horizon, but all I saw was a great expanse of raging gray-green water. Hope, a fragile thing in the midst of such sadness, flickered and threatened to die. "There's something out there," Sarah said, her voice barely audible over the rush of waves against the hull. She held a jagged piece of driftwood, her knuckles as white as bone. We dismissed her remarks as those of a terrified child. What else might be found in this watery wilderness than ruin and despair? But as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in bruised purple and blood orange, I saw it. A fin slashed across the sea and surrounded our little boat. Neither a playful dolphin's dorsal fin nor a shark's sleek, frightening look. This fin was distinctive. The bigger, more ancient item was encrusted with barnacles and fur-like growths. Fear, frigid and primal, twists in my stomach. "Finn," I said quietly, my voice hoarse, "look." He followed my gaze, his face pale as he saw the fin circle closer, cutting through the water with an eerie grace that screamed might and hunger, chilling me to the bone. "Get down!" he cried, pulling Sarah and me into the boat's little cabin, where we might be relatively safe. We huddled together, breath trapped in our throats, listening as the creature circled closer, its movements barely breaching the water's surface. The sun disappeared beyond the horizon, leaving the world in darkness. A thick layer of storm clouds obscured the stars, which are often a source of comfort and direction. We were alone, trapped in a sea of darkness, hunted by something ancient and ferocious. A loud, guttural growl echoed over the water, as if the earth were wailing in agony, and trembled through the very hull of the sea star. Then it hit us. The creature, its whole body still hidden under the water, smashed into the boat with such force that we were tossed about. The timber broke, and the deck leaned dangerously as water sloshed over the rails. Finn grasped a gaff hook, his countenance dismal yet resolute. "Get to the life raft," he yelled, barely audible over the breaking waves and the creature's violent howls. Caleb, eyes wide with terror, dashed for the life raft, but it was too late. The beast rushed, its massive head breaking the water's surface. It was a beast, the manifestation of a nightmare. Its skin was a patchwork of scales and rotting flesh. Its eyes sparkled with an unusual internal brilliance, and its jaws, filled with rows of razor-sharp fangs, gaped open in a wordless scream. Caleb never had a chance. The beast snatched him up in its fangs, cutting short his scream as it sank under the waves, leaving only a swirl of crimson water and an echo of our fear. Finn, his face pale, pushed Sarah and me toward the life raft. "Go," he shouted, his voice heavy with agony and despair. "Get out of here." We didn't hesitate. We clambered onto the fragile raft and wrestled with the release catch. As we drifted away, the beast returned, its teeth stained scarlet and its eyes fixed on us with a hunger that foreshadowed a long, awful death. But Finn stood between us, clutching the gaff hook like a weapon, his visage a mask of defiance against the unavoidable. "Get the hell out of here," he said, his voice a primal scream against the dwindling light. "And don't you ever look back." We never saw him again. We were found 2 days later, clinging to the wreckage of the life raft, with our bodies battered and our minds shattered. They did not believe our story. They said it was only the storm, the lunacy of hunger and despair. But we knew the truth. We had peered into the abyss, and it had taken something from us that we could never get back. We were adrift, not just at sea, but in a world where monsters lurked under the waves. And our only hope was that they would never rise to the surface. Story 19. The air crackled with static, and the hum of the weather station remained continuous in the cramped, windowless chamber. I was a meteorologist on the graveyard shift at the National Weather Service headquarters in Jacksonville, Florida. It was hurricane season, and Hurricane Theodore, a Category 3 storm, was churning up the coast, posing a direct danger to Florida's millions of residents. I've always liked hurricanes. Their tremendous force, unexpected nature, and ability to transform the planet in a matter of hours. But tonight, I felt uneasy, a prickling in the back of my neck, telling me that this storm was different. It began quietly, a tiny whisper among the white noise of the weather radio, a voice borne by the wind, too low and distorted to be heard. I disregarded it at first, blaming exhaustion and the incessant hum of the machinery. But the murmurs remained, becoming louder and more forceful, and weaving themselves into the fabric of the storm itself. I was looking at the Doppler radar, watching Theodore's spinning bands of rain lashing the shore, when I heard it again. This time it was clearer, a raspy elderly voice saying my name. Thomas. Thomas. My blood became chilly. I swung around, my pulse racing in my chest, but I was alone in the dimly lighted room, with just the weather station's flashing lights and humming servers for company. I attempted to justify it, blaming it on stress and lack of sleep, but deep down, I had a primeval terror, an unshakable belief that I was dealing with something beyond science and reason. The rumors followed me home that morning, a persistent hum on the outside of my hearing. I attempted to block them out with music, television, and the sound of my own voice, but they were constantly there, a disturbing reminder that I was not alone. The whispering at the weather station were more intense that night. They were no longer simply my name, but parts of words, cryptic warnings, and cries for aid, all given in the same raspy, old tone. The storm, tea's coming. It is hungry. Follow the warnings, turn back before it's too late. I attempted to concentrate on my duties, on following Theodore's movements and delivering timely alerts to those in danger. But the words, like cold tendrils, wormed their way into my thoughts, diverting me and instilling a rising sensation of fear. I began to see faces developing in the whirling clouds, as well as eyes peering back at me from the storm's center. My co-workers observed my preoccupation and unpredictable conduct. They ascribed it to stress, long hours, and the demands of hurricane season. But I knew better. Something was talking with me, something old and strong, something that rode the storm, its voice borne by the wind, and it was attempting to warn me. The murmurs became louder as Theodore approached, its anger surpassing even the most catastrophic forecasts. It's arrived, T's furious. It will consume us all. I stared in fear as the radar screen flashed, the storm's eye, which was typically a well-defined circle, changing into a monstrous, gaping mouth with fangs made of whirling clouds and lightning. The power went out, leaving the weather station in darkness. I struggled for my flashlight, my pulse thumping in my chest and the words echoing in the darkness louder than before. You have seen too much. Oh no, too much. Now, you'll join US. I fell back, grasping for the door, anxious to escape the darkness, the murmurs, and the creature that was approaching me. Unfortunately, it was too late. Something cold and wet brushed over my palm, eliciting a primitive and desperate cry. The following morning, they discovered me crouched in a corner of the weather station, my eyes wide with panic, and my clothing saturated in a weird, sticky fluid that smelled of the sea and something other, something old and nasty. I was talking incoherently, shouting about whispering in the wind, faces in the rain, and an old and ravenous creature that was coming for us all. They said I was suffering from tiredness, post-traumatic stress disorder, and the consequences of extended exposure to the storm. But I knew the truth. The wind had whispered secrets to me, and the storm had seized me for its own. I was no longer just a meteorologist, a scientist who studied weather. I was a conduit, a vessel, a prisoner of the storm and the old unknown creature that sailed on its winds. The whispers never ceased. They followed me everywhere, a continuous reminder of the darkness lurking on the outside of reality, waiting for the ideal time to burst through and seize the world as its own.